me? Is that working or? Yeah. Good evening. Absolutely wonderful to be here with you this evening, and I'm so inspired by everything I've heard from all the speakers. I'm going to talk to you a little bit. The first part of what I'll talk to you about isn't particularly about food. It's about my background in gardening. And initially that was very much not about food, but how that has changed over the years. But first of all, as an Irish person standing in front of you in London this evening, it is probably important to note what happened in Ireland between 1845 and 1850 with the Great Potato Famine, where 1 million people died and 1 million people and 2 million people left the island. And it is only last year that that population rebalance has begun to grow in a positive way. So food is very much part of our cultural history and everything about us. It's part of our DNA. The reliance on potato, the reliance on the potato on an island which is a fantastic island with an amazing climate for growing anything, with a temperate climate where we could grow all sorts of food. We were growing all sorts of food, but Irish people in the main, especially in the west of Ireland, couldn't afford to eat that food, so it was exported, and much of it would have come to this island. And those type of things are still going on in so many countries and so many vulnerable places around the world. So really just to make a note of that, of how important food is and how important that the thoughts, I think, that have been expressed this evening about what we rely on. I want to talk about gardeners and the gardeners who have influenced me. And the first gardener, Tim was talking about, you can't, or choose your parents carefully. So this was me choosing this lad to be my dad. And this is my dad, who's looking very, very glamorous in this particular image. It looks like he's in Italy, but actually he's on a pond in Southport. And he wasn't the gardener. He was from inner city Dublin, and he was trying to woo this woman, my mum, at the time, and she wasn't the gardener either. They were from inner city Dublin, where they had kind of Coronation Street backyards, but no place to plant. Very industrious people, Catholic, but almost Protestant in terms of their work ethic. They came over here once they married in 1959 and worked here for, Dad held down 3 full-time jobs, and Mum earned more as a shoe salesperson in Lillian Skinner's in Piccadilly Circus, including selling the shoes to the Princess Margaret wedding party or something like that. Anyway, in 1964, they had enough money to go home to buy a house in the suburbs of Dublin, and that's what they did. I think we see that house now, and there we are. They had 5 kids, which obviously changed the look of my dad very, very swiftly. And the first garden I ever saw being created was an amazing thing. My parents were not creative. My dad was a big opera buff, but my parents were not traditionally creative. So when we moved in kind of 69 or 70 into this house in the suburbs of Dublin, I was fascinated to see any sort of creativity. And I was upstairs looking down at my dad and my uncle Chris, and they were making the first garden, and I couldn't wait to see what they were going to do. I don't know why at that age I was fascinated by change in landscape, but this was amazing to me. And they dug out all the stones and they took away the rubble, and they did that landscaper's dance, and they had an area that was bare and ready for planting up. And what did they do? Well, they did exactly the same as the neighbours on one side and the other side, and their neighbours, because everybody in 1970s Dublin created exactly the same garden. They planted a lawn. It wasn't a rollout lawn. It wasn't a plastic lawn. It was a proper lawn that you sprinkled seed at. In the center of that lawn, they planted a tree, because everybody planted a tree, and everybody planted the same tree. Any ideas what that tree was? Always a cherry tree. No, always a cherry tree, because the little girls making their first Holy Communion, looking very pious, would look great in the photographs under that cherry tree. The only other feature in the front garden in Dublin in 1970 was a border exactly that width. And in that border, they planted blue and white and blue and white and blue and white. The lawn became an island, and you had lobelia and alyssum. And unless you were very posh, that was gardening in 1970s Dublin. But I was really interested in this idea. Actually, I think we have a picture of that, of the house as it looks today. I was really interested in gardening, and I used to take my dad's tools, the spades and the shovels, and I used to go across the road and across the river and into the local park. And I wasn't allowed to dig at home, but I was allowed to dig, if I didn't tell the park keeper, under the trees, and I created my own kind of fantasy landscape. In 1970s Dublin, in the back garden, you were allowed to do something different. You got all the rubble from the front garden, and where two walls collided, you piled that up in a corner at the back. You went up to the Dublin mountains, you found rocks with moss on them, you dotted them into that pile, you planted alpines, and you pretended you were in the Cotswolds. That was gardening. In our neighborhood, this house existed, and my parents were very frustrated that this house existed. Because it was full of, it's in a place just up the road called Ballyboden, and it was full of stuff. And it was full of gnomes and thatched cottages and Victorian lampstands and Disneyland wishing wells. And whenever my parents had friends over from London, when we were passing this house on the way to a grand garden, they used to make them look the other way. But for me, and for any other child, if I was passing it, going to school or whatever, it made me smile. It had an effect. And I became, for years and years, absolutely fascinated by this small garden. I knew nothing about it, but it definitely had impact. It had plants, but they were plastic. My inspirations really in 1970s Dublin and 1980s Dublin came from television, and they came from the movies. And the best gardener I ever knew was Willy Wonka. Do you remember the look on the face of the kids when they were shown the factory in the movie? It was really quite extraordinary. But it also came from the BBC. My parents would only let us watch educational programs, and Blue Peter and Newsround were regarded as educational. So I saw my first ever kind of live gardener, and that was Percy Thrower. And each St. Patrick's Day, he used to come on the Board na Mona float in the St. Patrick's Day parade in Dublin, and I thought he was a rock star. And he changed space. He made that Italianate garden, the sunken garden, at Television Centre. And to me, this was amazing. And that's exactly what I wanted to do. I want to follow on what Percy Thrower was doing. Years later, I ended up at the BBC at a Hootenanny event. You know, the Jules Holland event. And these lads came over and asked me, at 3 o'clock in the morning, did I know where the Blue Peter garden was? This is the rock group Primal Scream, and we went and rearranged the guy in the centre isn't the rock star. He's the security guard who threw us out of the BBC. But my heroes were gardeners, and we used to watch this program, this terribly funny program, and it was kind of anarchic in a way, because here was somebody in the suburbs in a different country, and they were digging up the garden, the front garden, the back garden, and they were growing fruit and vegetables and keeping pigs and stuff like that, and their neighbours were tut-tutting at them, but it was amazing to see. It was the first time really food came into my head as a gardener. This was something you can grow, and it wasn't ornamental. So that was Tom and Barbara. And there was something else. There was another program that was on a Saturday evening. And on this program, which was even from a place much further away, people used to gather for breakfast every morning around this table. And they used to enjoy themselves and sit outside and have a meal. And I was amazed. Anybody remember the program? Dallas. Do you remember Miss Ellie? And eventually, I got over to meet Sue Ellen at Sad Fork. Next slide. But gardening and food, gardening and creativity has been something that has been central to kind of everything I've ever done. There's nothing new about gardening. This is hydroponics from thousands of years ago in Peru. And it's absolutely amazing. They weave these wicker islands, and the roots, fill them with some soil, plant into them, and the roots would go and get the nutrients from the lake, the lake below. Gardening has been a way of growing food. It's been a way of decoration. It's been a way of control, as we see here with one of the Renaissance Italian gardens, or at Versailles here, where it's man controlling nature and showing how dominant, controlling nature, controlling people, and letting other people in distant territories know how powerful they were, as with the Sun King Louis XIV at Versailles, the garden La Notre game designed for him. But gardening has also, and farming has become a thing of protest. And when we're so sometimes in cities divorced for the land, there was this incredible guy called Gavin, and he organized farmers to come and make a protest in the center of Paris. And 1 million people turned out to see what farmers do. So in France, they certainly do it with style, because the Champs-Élysées became this remarkable farm. Another remarkable garden, I absolutely love this story. It's Beijing, and it's a guy who made a lot of money being a dentist, I think, or something like that. So he decided that he was going to build a rockery on top of the building that he lived on. And this is the building. He didn't look for permissions. He just built it. It was full of ponds and planting and fruit and vegetables. And eventually one of the koi ponds started to leak into a neighbor's sitting room, and the government made him take it down. But really quite an extraordinary thing. So I love that. I started doing gardens. I went to college, actually. I went to college in the Botanic Gardens in Dublin from 1985 to 1988, and half my time was spent learning about chemicals and how to mix chemicals and how to wash out the watering cans after mixing chemicals. And innately, I thought that was wrong, because soil is our growing medium. Soil, the compost that we make through the organic matter that we collect, is so precious. And we were being taught about chemicals to slow things down, to hurry things up, and it was all about yield, and that's a dangerous thing. So I went, came over here, started making various gardens at the Chelsea Flower Show. This is a tower garden that we made maybe about 10 years ago at Chelsea, exploring the idea of gardening on a multi-story in cities where land is scarce. Could you make various gardens on top of each other? And indeed, some were fruit and vegetables. We also did this maddest thing, a flying garden. It's the only garden with Ryanair seatbelts on Lutyens benches in a hanging basket that's raised above the crowds in Chelsea, but it was fun. It was the Wonkavator, of course. It was trying something new and exploring. After all that, you know, all sorts of things, you get to travel if you work in television, and I did some traveling, and I went to Kenya at one stage, and I met somebody who kind of, just by what she was doing, absolutely pulled me up and made me think about everything. 2 bloody minutes. No, I'm the last. I can have 5 minutes. Can I? I was in. So I met a woman in Kenya in the most remarkable, kind of beautiful but ravaged landscape. Her name was Damarius Ndunda, and she had 4 children. Her husband worked hours away in Nairobi, and she was on a baked kind of landscape where it was drought or it was flooding and whatever. And she was told there was only 2 crops that she would grow, and that was maize and beans. And she looked at her 4 kids, and she wanted them to have a varied diet, and she wanted to educate them. And she developed a whole series of tanks and rills and gutters. And every time the rain came, all these tanks that she had made out of baked mud bricks that she plastered filled with water. And all of a sudden she had an orchard of 140 citrus trees, and she was growing bananas and pawpaw and onions and the most incredible range of plants. And here was somebody whose kind of life and future, and the future of her family and the future of her kids depended on that. So that made me think and of course we were using losing all the resources that in the West that were so scarce where she was. So the Maoris had a huge impact on me. When I came back, I heard about more people. I think the next slide we'll see will be, maybe the next one after that, is going, oh, and then Epi was born. Epi was born. Epi was born only a few miles from here. In the Blackpool week of Strictly Come Dancing, I said I couldn't do the Blackpool week, so they sent me a helicopter because Epi was only 2 days old and we knew nobody else in London, and Justin said I had to be back in time. Epi is not a gardener. Epi hates gardening. That's Epi growing up. The next one is Epi growing up a little bit more, and now she's 18. I'm not allowed to show any more photographs of Epi. But it did make me think about growing food, so we moved back to Ireland and we planted fruit trees and we planted potatoes and onions and carrots and lettuce and all of that amazing produce in our garden in County Wicklow. And then I came across this amazing lady called Pam Warhurst, who lived in Todmorden in Yorkshire, and her town, which had 16,000 people living in it, was dying. And it was dying because it was a mill town, and all the kids were born and educated just to leave, to come to London, to go to Manchester or Liverpool or wherever, because there was no future. And Pam Warhurst had an idea that she would do something without asking for permission. She'd go outside her house and she'd ask people to join her outside her house, and she'd plant up areas with fruit and vegetables. So outside the police station, she planted corn, and the police were absolutely delighted because people came and talked to them, and the police weren't used to talking. And anybody could plant and anybody could harvest, and an amazing organization grew out of that. And Todmorden, through food, through growing your own, through harvesting this food, really regained pride in itself. And this organization that I set up really kind of quietly and very elegantly has really inspired people in so many different countries around the world. And we'll just see a few images if we flick through of Todmorden. That's outside the police station. Just everywhere they grow, and anybody can join in. There are no rules. And it's food to share. You do whatever you want to do. There was a £6 million health centre built with just kind of county council planting around it, thorny bushes for security. They went and asked the doctors, and the doctor said, if it doesn't cost us anything, do what you want. And now the whole place is a Garden of Eden. And there's Pam with her friends. Mary, no, Pam and Mary. Yeah, there was so both of them. So this is have you been there, Tim? It's amazing, isn't it? It really is amazing. I'm going to flick on till the end. So this is another, because I want to go back to that first garden. Flick on kind of slowly so you don't, these are amazing people. The Cork Rooftop Farm, Jim Denevin, after this. So I had an idea, and we're going to take a whole borough in Northern Ireland and we're going to change it to be a botanical borough, and we're going to grow all these things, and they're going to let me do it, which is very exciting. So that's it. Now, stay there. Do you remember the first garden we saw? A few years ago, when I was all grown up, I realized this garden has stuck with me. The first image I had taken 25 years ago of all the gnomes on slide film, and it was very blurred. And I thought, I really want to find out more about this garden and more about this person who made that garden. So I went back to find the garden, and this is what the garden looked like. And I was devastated that the gnome garden was gone. So I went on a radio program and I asked them, would anybody have any memories of this garden? And let's look at the next photograph, because people did have memories. And some of the memories were pictorial, and you could really see some details of what was in that garden. And all sorts of email, and they put me in touch with the daughter of the lady, and she told me all about the garden. But there was one email that came in that they didn't want to read on air, and I will leave you with this evening, because Mrs. Pegman, even though her plants were plastic, is an inspiration to me. So this is the story of somebody who lived locally, who knew the story of the garden and knew the story of the demise of the garden. And it's a bit slightly, Graham Norton and the red chair. You want to pull that lever in the first few sentences, but Mrs. Pegman. Our family, they've never heard of commas or full stops also. Our family lived behind Mrs. Pegman and knew her well. We're pretty steeped in the history of the place. The local soccer pitch is named for my great-uncle Frank Kelly, and our grandfather John Kearns used to run the local grocery shop. Great. Her daughter still lives in that house, but when her mother died, she dumped all the poor gnomes, K-N-O-M-B-S, over the wall and across the road and into the river, and they would have drowned if Shay Kelly didn't rescue them. He put them all back in her garden, but when Ann Pegman got home, she was shocked, so she fucked them all back in the river and told Shay Kelly that she didn't give a shit if they drowned or not, as she hated the little fickers. Thank you very much.